13 warships faced 333. Every military manual ever written said this was suicide. The Korean admiral commanding those 13 ships had just been released from prison, tortured by his own government, stripped of his rank, and recalled only because his replacement had gotten the entire Korean Navy slaughtered. His officers begged him to disband the fleet and retreat to land. The Japanese armada approaching could see Korean masts on the horizon and laughed. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be target practice. But Admiral Yi Sun-sin looked at those 13 ships, looked at the approaching forest of enemy sails, and said 5 words that would echo through history. "I still have 12 battleships remaining." He'd miscounted in his exhausted state, but the message was clear. As long as he drew breath, as long as one ship floated, Korea would fight. What happened next on October 26, 1597, would defy every law of naval warfare. By sunset, 31 Japanese warships would lie shattered at the bottom of the Myeongnyang Strait. Thousands of enemy sailors would be dead. And Admiral Yi's 13 ships, not one sunk, not one sailor killed, 0 casualties while facing 25-1 odds. This isn't legend, this isn't exaggeration. This is documented history that military academies worldwide still struggle to explain. How does a commander turn certain annihilation into total victory? How do you fight 300 ships with 13 and walk away without losing a single man? The answer involves the world's most dangerous waterway, tactical genius that borders on supernatural, and one man's absolute refusal to accept the impossible. The year 1597 marked Korea's darkest hour. For 5 years, Japanese warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi had been trying to conquer the Korean peninsula as a stepping stone to invading China. His armies had landed with over 150,000 soldiers, samurai warriors who'd spent decades fighting Japan's civil wars. They were the most experienced, most brutal fighting force in East Asia. Korea was being torn apart. Cities burned. Civilians died by the thousands. The Japanese war machine seemed unstoppable on land, but there was one problem. Their supply lines crossed water, and controlling those sea routes meant controlling the war. That's where Admiral Yi Sun-sin had made his reputation. Yi wasn't born to be a naval commander. He started as an army officer, passed the military examination at age 32, late by Korean standards. Nothing about his early career suggested greatness. He was known for being incorruptible, which in the corrupt Korean court made him more enemies than friends. Nobles who wanted to embezzle funds hated him. Officers who wanted to accept bribes despised him. But when war came in 1592, Yi was given command of a naval district. He took to naval warfare like he'd been born on water. He understood something fundamental that others missed. Ships weren't just floating platforms for soldiers. They were weapons themselves. He oversaw construction of the Jeobukseon, turtle ships, ironclad vessels with covered decks and cannons firing in every direction, naval fortresses that could smash through enemy lines. For 5 years, Yi won every naval battle he fought. Every single one. The Japanese couldn't establish naval superiority because wherever they sailed, Yi was waiting. He understood Korean waters, the tides, the currents, the weather patterns. He knew where to fight and when to fight. His victories weren't close calls. They were systematic destruction of Japanese naval power. The Japanese started calling him the Shield of Korea. They feared him more than they feared entire armies. And that fear led to their most desperate strategy. If they couldn't beat Yi in battle, they'd beat him in court. Japanese agents spread rumors, bribed Korean officials, created false intelligence reports. They claimed Yi was planning to defect, that he was deliberately avoiding battle, that he was in secret communication with the enemy. None of it was true, but in the paranoid Korean court, truth didn't matter as much as politics. In 1597, King Seonjo ordered Yi's arrest. The admiral who'd saved Korea repeatedly was dragged from his flagship in chains. He was stripped of his rank, tortured to force a confession of treason. They beat him until bones broke, whipped him until his back was raw meat. Standard procedure demanded he be executed, but someone in the court recognized what madness this was. Ye was stripped of command but allowed to live, demoted to common soldier. His replacement was Won Gyun, a politically connected officer who'd always been jealous of Ye's success. Won Gyun took command of the Korean fleet, over 200 warships, the entire naval power of the nation. He immediately announced he would crush the Japanese Navy in one decisive battle. The Battle of Chilcheonryang in July 1597 wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Won Gyun led the entire Korean fleet into a Japanese trap. The enemy had been waiting, planning, preparing for months. They'd learned from fighting Yi. They knew Korean ships were powerful but needed smart commanders. Won Gyun gave them exactly what they wanted. Overconfident and inexperienced in actual naval combat, he sailed into shallow waters where his ships couldn't maneuver. The Japanese swarmed from multiple directions. Korean ships collided with each other, trying to escape. Captains abandoned their vessels. Crews jumped overboard to swim to shore. By the time the sun set on Chilcheonryang, over 200 Korean warships were destroyed. Thousands of sailors were dead. The entire southern coast lay defenseless. Japan controlled the seas absolutely. Their supply lines were secured. Reinforcements could pour in freely. Korea was doomed. That's when the king realized what he'd done. In his paranoia, he'd destroyed the one man who could save them. Desperate messages went out. Find Yi Sun-sin. Bring him back. Give him whatever's left of the navy. What was left? After the catastrophe at Chilcheonryang, after the panic and desertions, exactly 13 functional warships remained. 13. Most were damaged. Crews were depleted, demoralized, terrified. These were the survivors, the ones who'd escaped the massacre, and they were expected to face the same Japanese fleet that had just destroyed 200 ships. Ye received his orders while serving as a common soldier with the army. He was being recalled to naval command, given the impossible task of defending the western sea routes with 13 ships. Military advisors told him to disband the fleet. It was pointless. 13 ships couldn't stop the Japanese Navy. Better to fight on land, use what sailors remained as infantry. That's when Yi said it. The words that every Korean schoolchild learns. I still have 12 battleships and I am still alive. The enemy shall never be safe. He'd miscounted. There were 13 ships, not 12, but the exact number didn't matter. The meaning was clear. As long as Yi Sun-sin lived, as long as he had even one ship under his command, he would fight. Surrender wasn't in his vocabulary. Retreat wasn't an option he considered. The Japanese wanted naval supremacy. They'd have to take it from his cold, dead hands. Yi took command of his tiny fleet in August 1597. He toured each ship personally, speaking to the captains, meeting the sailors, assessing what he had to work with. These weren't the elite crews he'd commanded before. Most of his best captains had died at Chilcheonryang. The sailors were terrified, traumatized by the massacre they'd witnessed or heard about. But Yi had something the previous commander lacked. The common sailors trusted him. They'd heard stories of his victories. They knew he never asked his men to go anywhere he wouldn't lead. His own son had died in battle fighting under his command. Yi understood loss. He understood sacrifice. And most importantly, he understood how to win. He gathered intelligence obsessively. Where was the Japanese fleet? How many ships? What were their supply situations? What routes were they using? Spies and scouts brought information. Korean civilians who'd seen Japanese movements reported what they knew. Yi built a picture of enemy intentions. The Japanese were planning a massive assault through the western sea routes. They would bring their entire available fleet, over 300 warships, to smash through whatever remained of Korean naval resistance. Once they controlled those waters, they could supply their armies indefinitely. The war would be over. Yi studied his maps and charts. He knew every island, every strait, every peculiarity of the Korean coastline. There was one location that kept drawing his attention: the Myeongnyang Strait, called Uldolmok by Koreans, the roaring waterway. It was one of the most dangerous passages in the world. Narrow, barely 1,000 feet across at its tightest point. But the real danger wasn't the width, it was the current. Tidal forces created currents that reached 11 knots, faster than most ships could sail against. The water didn't just flow, it roared through that passage with such force that the sound could be heard from miles away. Most captains avoided Uldolmok when possible. The timing had to be perfect. Sail through at the wrong moment and currents would dash ships against rocks or spin them out of control. Even experienced pilots treated it with respect, bordering on fear. Ye looked at that strait and saw salvation. The Japanese had hundreds of ships. In open water, they would surround his 13 vessels and destroy them with overwhelming numbers. But in Uldolmok, in that narrow passage with those deadly currents, numbers would become a curse, not an advantage. The geography was perfect. The strait ran between Jindo Island and the mainland, creating a natural bottleneck. Korean ships could position themselves at the narrowest point, blocking passage. The Japanese would have to come through that choke point if they wanted to advance. They couldn't surround Yi's fleet. They couldn't bring their full numbers to bear. They'd have to fight in a confined space where 13 ships could hold off 300. But timing was everything. The tidal currents changed every 6 hours. For about 3 hours, water rushed through the strait in one direction. Then came a brief period of slack water where currents were minimal. Then 3 hours of current flowing the opposite direction. Yi's plan was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its precision. He would position his ships to defend during slack water when Japanese vessels could maneuver relatively safely. Let them advance. Let them think they could overwhelm his small fleet through sheer numbers. Then, when the current reversed, when the roaring waters became a weapon, that's when the real killing would begin. The Japanese wouldn't understand these waters. Their captains were experienced in naval combat, but not in Korean coastal conditions. They didn't know how deadly Uldolmok could be. They'd see 13 Korean ships and think it was going to be easy. Their confidence would drive them into the trap. Yi explained his plan to his captains. Some thought he was insane. Fight at Uldolmok? That was suicide even in the best circumstances. With 13 ships against 300? Madness. But Yi's logic was undeniable. Anywhere else meant certain defeat. In the strait, they had a chance. A small chance, but better than none. He positioned his ships carefully. The Panoxion battleships, multi-decked fortresses with dozens of cannons, would form the defensive line. Yi's flagship, the largest and most powerful, would be at the vanguard. He would lead from the front, visible to every sailor in his fleet. Where Yi fought, his men would fight. The preparations were desperate. Ammunition was collected from every source. Cannons were repaired and tested. Crews drilled constantly on loading and firing procedures. Every sailor needed to know his role perfectly. There would be no time for confusion during battle. Yi's men worked knowing what they faced. Intelligence reports confirmed it. 333 Japanese warships were approaching. The scouts who brought the news were pale with fear. Some sailors deserted. They couldn't see how 13 ships could survive, let alone win. Better to flee now than die in the coming slaughter. But most stayed. They stayed because Yi stayed. Because their admiral looked at impossible odds and refused to blink. Because something in his absolute confidence made them believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. Yi sent messengers to nearby Korean forces. If the battle went badly, if the Japanese broke through, They needed to be ready. But he also sent one message that shocked everyone who heard it. He told them to prepare for victory, to be ready to exploit Japanese defeat. That confidence, that absolute certainty, was either genius or madness. The Japanese fleet approached in late October. Their scouts reported Korean ships waiting in Myeongnyang Strait, 13 vessels. The Japanese commanders couldn't believe their luck. The legendary Yi Sun-sin, reduced to 13 ships, had chosen to make his stand in a narrow strait. Perfect. They'd bottle him up and destroy him completely. They saw the narrow passage not as a tactical nightmare, but as a killing ground where the Koreans couldn't escape. 333 ships would advance. The front vessels would engage Yi's fleet directly while others waited their turn. Like feeding a beast, they'd throw ships at the Koreans until the defense collapsed. What the Japanese didn't understand was the current. They'd been told about tidal flows, but they'd never experienced Uldolmok. They didn't grasp what 11-knot currents meant. They didn't know that 3 hours of slack water would become 3 hours of liquid chaos. October 26, 1597. Dawn broke over the strait with clear skies. Perfect weather for a naval battle. Yi stood on his flagship's deck, watching the eastern horizon. His sailors were at their stations, cannons loaded, weapons ready. They could hear it now, the sound of hundreds of ships approaching, oars splashing, orders being shouted in Japanese. The enemy was here. Then they saw them. Sails. Dozens of sails, then hundreds. The Japanese fleet appeared like a forest of masts and flags. They filled the horizon from shore to shore. The sight was overwhelming. 333 warships advancing in formation, confident and unstoppable. Yi's sailors felt their hearts sink. Actually seeing the enemy numbers was different from hearing about them. This was real. This was happening. They were about to fight over 300 ships with 13. But Yi raised his flag, the signal to hold position. His voice carried across the water, calm and certain. Wait for my command. Hold your positions. Fire only when I signal. The Japanese fleet approached the strait entrance. Their vanguard ships advanced with arrogance. They could see the tiny Korean fleet ahead. 13 ships Yang to block the passage. It would take minutes to crush them. Japanese officers called out encouragement to their men. This was going to be easy. The current was slack. Timing was perfect for the Japanese advance. Their ships entered Uldolmok's narrow passage with confidence. The lead vessels were large, well-armed, filled with Marines ready for boarding actions. Japanese naval doctrine focused on grappling and boarding. Get close, throw hooks, swarm enemy decks with overwhelming numbers of samurai warriors. Yi waited. His ships held a curved defensive line across the strait's narrowest point. The Panoxion battleships were positioned perfectly. High-sided vessels that looked like floating fortresses, multiple decks lined with cannons. These weren't built for speed or maneuverability. They were built for devastating firepower. The Japanese vanguard came within range. Still, Yi waited. He could see their faces now, could see the Japanese officers pointing at his ships, giving orders. They expected the Koreans to flee or try to sail past them. Instead, Yi's fleet sat motionless, blocking the passage. Then Yi raised his hand. Flags signaled down the line. Every Korean cannon fired simultaneously. The sound was deafening. Thunder multiplied by dozens of guns firing together. Cannonballs screamed across the water, covering the few hundred yards in seconds. They slammed into Japanese hulls with devastating force. Wood exploded. Masts shattered. The lead Japanese ships took direct hits from multiple cannons. Korean gunnery was superior to Japanese. Yi had trained his crews relentlessly. They could reload faster, aim more accurately, fire more guns in the same time. The Panoxion design gave them elevated firing positions. shooting down at Japanese vessels. Every advantage Yi could create, he'd built into his defensive position. The Japanese vanguard staggered. Ships that had been advancing confidently were suddenly holed, taking on water, crew members scattered or dead, but they kept coming. There were too many behind them to retreat even if they wanted to. The pressure of ships pushing from behind drove them forward into Korean guns. Yi's ships fired in rotation, devastating coordinated volleys, followed by individual cannons firing as fast as crews could reload. The narrow strait became a shooting gallery. Japanese ships had to advance into that storm of cannon fire. They couldn't spread out. They couldn't flank. The geography forced them to come straight at Korean guns. Arquebus fire added to the carnage. Korean Marines lined the rails with matchlock guns, shooting at Japanese sailors. Arrows flew from both sides. But the real killing came from the cannons. Shot after shot smashing into Japanese hulls, tearing through wood, killing crew members, destroying rigging. The first Japanese ships began sinking. Holed below the waterline, they took on water faster than crews could bail. Men jumped overboard, trying to swim to other vessels or to shore. But the narrow strait meant there was nowhere safe to swim. Wreckage filled the water. Bodies floated among the debris. More Japanese ships pushed forward. They had to. The battle plan required overwhelming the Korean position through sheer numbers. Send enough ships, and eventually the Korean guns would be overrun. But Yi's positioning was too good. The narrow passage meant only a handful of Japanese ships could engage at once. The rest waited behind them, useless, unable to bring their numbers into the fight. Korean discipline held. Yi's captains followed his signals precisely. They didn't panic despite seeing the massive enemy fleet. They focused on the immediate threats, the ships within cannon range. Fire, reload, fire again. The mechanical routine of naval gunnery continued without pause. An hour into the battle, the Japanese had lost ships, but hadn't broken through. Their commanders were growing frustrated. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. 13 ships shouldn't be able to hold off their entire fleet. But the narrow strait and Korean firepower were creating a bottleneck that numbers couldn't break. Then the tide began to change. Yi felt it first. The subtle shift in how his flagship rode the water. The current was reversing. Slack water was ending. The roaring would begin soon. He'd timed it perfectly. The Japanese fleet was committed now. Dozens of ships in the strait. More trying to enter behind them. They were bunched together, packed into the narrow passage, when the current began to reverse. Uldolmok earned its name. The roaring sound built gradually, then exploded into a thunderous rush of water. The current, which had been minimal, suddenly accelerated to its full 11-knot fury. Water surged through the strait with such force that it created whirlpools and standing waves. Japanese ships lost control immediately. Captains who'd been focused on attacking Korean vessels suddenly found themselves fighting the water. Rudders couldn't compensate for the current's strength. Ships began spinning, turning sideways, crashing into each other. The narrow passage became chaos. Vessels that had been in neat formations moments before were now colliding, tangling rigging, smashing oars. Japanese sailors screamed commands that couldn't be heard over the water's roar. Officers tried to organize their ships and failed. The current was too strong, too sudden, too overwhelming. Yi's ships held their positions. He'd anchored them or positioned them where the current's effects were minimal. Korean crews had prepared for this. They knew what was coming. While Japanese ships spun out of control, Korean cannons continued firing with mechanical precision. Now the real slaughter began. Japanese vessels caught in the current couldn't fight back effectively. They couldn't aim their own guns, couldn't maneuver for boarding actions, couldn't retreat against the current's force. They were helpless targets floating in front of Korean guns. Yi's crews fired as fast as they could load. At this range, every shot hit. Cannonballs tore through Japanese hulls. Ships already damaged from the earlier fighting began breaking apart under the combined stress of cannon fire and current. The water churned with wreckage and bodies. Japanese ships at the rear of their formation tried to retreat, but the narrow strait meant they couldn't turn around easily. Ships blocked each other. The current pushed from behind, driving them forward into the killing zone. Captains screamed at each other. Turyeng to coordinate, Turyeng to create space. It was useless. The roaring current created a traffic jam of death. Ships at the front were being destroyed by Korean cannons. Ships in the middle were caught in the current, spinning, colliding. Ships at the rear couldn't retreat because of vessels behind them. The Japanese numerical advantage had become a curse. Too many ships in too small a space. Korean cannons fired without pause. Crews worked in the practiced rhythm of loading and firing. Yi's years of training showed now. His gunners could reload in half the time it took Japanese crews. They could aim despite the current's turbulence. They could maintain discipline while watching enemy ships destroyed by the dozens. The water literally turned red. Thousands of Japanese sailors died in those hours, some from cannon fire, torn apart by iron balls. Some drowned when ships sank, pulled down by armor or trapped in wreckage. Some crushed between colliding vessels. The current carried bodies and debris through the strait, creating a spreading stain of blood and wreckage. Japanese morale shattered. These were experienced warriors who'd fought in countless battles, but they'd never experienced anything like this. The combination of narrow geography, superior Korean gunnery, and deadly currents created a nightmare beyond their comprehension. Ships that entered the strait simply disappeared, destroyed or sunk within minutes. Commanders tried to rally their forces, tried to organize another assault, but the sailors wouldn't advance. They could see what happened to ships that entered Uldolmok. They could see the current spinning vessels out of control. They could see Korean cannons firing endlessly into the chaos. Advancing meant Dayang, and for what? They couldn't even reach the enemy ships to fight. Yi pressed his advantage. His flagship advanced slightly, threatening to push forward into the disorganized Japanese formation. It was psychological warfare. The Japanese had come to destroy 13 Korean ships. Instead, those 13 ships were advancing toward them. The reversal was complete. Some Japanese captains attempted desperate tactics, ramming attacks, Turyeng to use their larger vessels as weapons. But the current made precise maneuvering impossible. Ships that tried to ram Korean vessels missed their targets, spun by the current into wrong angles. They crashed into the rocks instead, or into each other, adding to the carnage. The battle lasted for hours. The current continued its roaring surge, creating conditions that favored Yi's prepared defense. Korean cannons fired until barrels glowed hot. Crews worked through exhaustion, loading and firing, loading and firing. The mechanical rhythm continued. Japanese ships that managed to retreat from the strait's killing zone spread word to those behind them. Don't advance. The strait is death. Korean ships are invincible. The devil himself commands them. Panic spread through the fleet faster than any messenger could sail. By early afternoon, the Japanese assault had completely broken. Commanders recognized the disaster. They'd lost dozens of ships trying to force the passage. Hundreds more were damaged. Thousands of sailors were dead or wounded. And the Korean fleet? Still there. Still intact. Still blocking the strait with unbroken determination. The order went out. Retreat. Abandon the assault. The Japanese fleet began withdrawing, pulling back from Uldolmok's deadly waters. But the current made even retreat dangerous. Ships trying to exit the strait had to fight the flow. More vessels were damaged in the withdrawal, pushed against rocks or into each other. Yi watched them go. He didn't pursue aggressively. He understood his limitations. 13 ships couldn't chase 300. His advantage was defensive, tied to the geography of this strait. Leaving that position would risk the victory he'd achieved. Korean sailors could barely believe what they were seeing. The massive Japanese fleet, the unstoppable armada, was retreating. Running from 13 ships, men who'd been certain they would die this day were watching the enemy flee in disorder. Yi's flagship remained at the vanguard. His flag still flew, defiant and unbroken. He'd led from the front throughout the entire battle. His sailors could see him standing on deck, directing the fight. Fearless, despite the overwhelming odds. That image would be remembered for centuries. The admiral who refused to surrender, who turned certain death into impossible victory. As the Japanese fleet withdrew to count their losses, Korean sailors began checking their own damage. Ships had taken hits. Rigging was damaged. Holes had been punched in hulls. But nothing critical. Nothing that couldn't be repaired. The Panoxion design had proven its worth. The high sides and sturdy construction had withstood Japanese fire. Then came the casualty reports. Wounded, a handful. None of the injuries were life-threatening. And killed, 0. Not one Korean sailor had died in the battle. Against 333 enemy ships, with hours of intense combat, Yi's fleet had suffered 0 deaths. The number seemed impossible. Military commanders checking the reports thought there must be a mistake. How do you fight such a battle without losing men? But the reports were accurate. Perfect positioning, superior firepower, and the deadly current had protected Korean crews while destroying Japanese ships. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 31 warships confirmed destroyed, sunk or burned beyond salvage. Dozens more heavily damaged, some barely able to stay afloat during the retreat. Casualty estimates ranged from thousands to tens of thousands. The narrow strait had become a graveyard for Japan's naval ambitions. The strategic impact was immediate and overwhelming. The Japanese Western Sea route was blocked. Their plans to supply armies through those waters were finished. Yi, with 13 ships, had done what seemed mathematically impossible. He'd stopped the entire Japanese fleet. Word spread across Korea like wildfire. Yi had won. The disgraced admiral, the tortured prisoner, the man reduced to 13 ships, had achieved total victory. Church bells rang in Korean cities. People who'd been preparing for defeat suddenly had hope. If Yi could win against such odds, maybe Korea could survive. The Japanese reaction was shock and denial. Commanders sending reports to their leaders struggled to explain what had happened. How do you tell your superiors that 300 ships couldn't defeat 13? That the entire invasion plan collapsed because of one Korean admiral and a narrow strait? Some Japanese officers claimed supernatural intervention. They said Yi must have divine protection. No human could achieve such a victory through skill alone. The gods themselves must favor the Korean admiral. These reports, while obviously truing to deflect blame, revealed the psychological impact of the defeat. Japan's professional warriors had been broken not just militarily but mentally. Yi himself wrote about the battle with characteristic humility. His reports credited his sailors' courage and discipline. He mentioned the favorable geography. He noted the enemy's unfamiliarity with Korean waters. But he didn't boast about his own tactical genius. In Yi's mind, he'd simply done his duty. Protecting Korea was his responsibility. The method didn't matter, only the result. But everyone else understood what had happened. This was military genius at its purest. Yi had taken every disadvantage and turned it into advantage. Too few ships. Use narrow waters where numbers don't matter. Inferior numbers. Position where the enemy can't bring their strength to bear. Facing inevitable defeat. Choose ground where defeat becomes impossible. The Battle of Myeongnyang entered history as one of the most miraculous military victories ever recorded. Military academics study it centuries later. To understand how such odds were overcome. Naval officers learn Yi's tactics in their training. The battle becomes a case study in defensive warfare, tactical positioning, and leadership under impossible pressure. Korean morale, which had collapsed after Chilcheonryang, came roaring back. Yi began rebuilding the fleet. His victory attracted sailors and resources. Ships were built or repaired. Within months, the Korean Navy was again a significant force, all because 13 ships held a strait against 300. The Japanese invasion lost its momentum. Without control of the western sea routes, their armies couldn't be properly supplied. Yi continued winning naval battles, methodically destroying Japanese shipping. The war would continue for another year, but Japan had lost its best chance for victory. Yi Sun-sin's personal tragedy was that he never lived to see final peace. In December 1598, during the Battle of Noryang, the last major naval engagement of the war, Yi was struck by a stray bullet. He died on his flagship, commanding the battle even as his life bled away. His last words were reportedly instructions to hide his death so sailors wouldn't lose heart. Korea's eternal gratitude to Yi is absolute. Statues of him stand in cities across the country. His flagship has been reconstructed as a museum. Korean children learn his story in school. His life represents everything Koreans value: loyalty, courage, tactical brilliance, incorruptibility, and absolute devotion to protecting the nation. The question that haunts historians is simple. How was it possible? How do 13 ships defeat 300 with 0 casualties? The standard military answer involves geography, tactics, and leadership. But those explanations feel insufficient for such an extreme outcome. Perhaps the real answer is that perfect conditions met perfect preparation. Yi chose the battlefield with absolute precision. He understood his ship's capabilities completely. He trained his crews to the highest possible standard. He timed the battle to the tides exactly. Every single variable that could be controlled, Yi controlled perfectly. But beyond the technical analysis, there's something else. Something about Yi's character that made the impossible possible. His absolute refusal to accept defeat created a certainty in his men. They believed because he believed. They fought because he fought. When your admiral is standing on the flagship's deck, calm and confident while 300 enemy ships approach, you find courage you didn't know you possessed. Modern military analysts confirm what Koreans knew in 1597. Yi Sun-sin was one of history's greatest naval commanders. His tactical understanding, strategic vision, and leadership abilities place him among history's military elite. The fact that he never lost a battle in his career, that he won despite consistently being outnumbered, proves this wasn't luck or chance. The 13 ships that saved a nation represent more than tactical brilliance. They represent what's possible when genius meets determination, when a leader refuses to accept the obvious outcome, when preparation meets opportunity, when courage faces down impossible odds and prevails through sheer force of will. Yi's philosophy was simple. A warrior's duty is to fight regardless of odds. Whether you have 13 ships or 300, you fight to protect your people. Surrender is never considered. Retreat is never acceptable. You fight with what you have, where you are, against whoever comes. That philosophy, lived absolutely, created the miracle at Myeongnyang. 13 ships blocking a strait. 1 admiral refusing to yield. 0 casualties achieved against impossible odds. History remembers these things because they inspire, because they prove that sometimes, when everything says you must lose, perfect execution and unwavering courage can change fate itself. The roaring waterway of Uldolmok still churns with deadly currents. The tides still reverse with violent force. But Koreans sailing through that strait remember what happened there. How 13 ships became immortal. How 1 admiral's refusal to accept defeat saved a nation. How the impossible became real through genius, preparation, and absolute courage. Admiral Yi Sun-sin's victory at Myeongnyang stands as proof that numbers don't determine outcomes. Leadership determines outcomes. Strategy determines outcomes. The will to fight despite hopeless odds determines outcomes. 13 ships faced 333, and won completely because one man understood that defeat only comes when you accept it. Yi never accepted it. Not when tortured, not when imprisoned, not when given 13 ships against hundreds. His refusal to accept the impossible made the impossible real. That's the lesson of Myeongnyang. That's why the battle matters 4 centuries later. That's why military academies worldwide study those 13 ships. Because sometimes, just sometimes, genius and courage can overcome any odds. Sometimes one person's absolute certainty can inspire others to achieve the impossible. Sometimes 13 is enough, if those 13 refuse to surrender, refuse to yield, refuse to accept that the battle is already lost. The Korean admiral stood on his flagship's deck, watched 300 enemy ships approach, and smiled. He had 13 ships, and he was still alive. That was enough. That would always be enough. Because Admiral Yi Sun-sin understood something fundamental about warfare, about leadership, about human courage. Victory doesn't belong to the largest fleet or the biggest army. Victory belongs to those who refuse to accept defeat. And in the roaring waters of Myeongnyang Strait, that refusal to surrender created the most miraculous naval victory in human history. 0 casualties, 31 enemy ships destroyed, 300 vessels turned back by 13. These numbers defy explanation through conventional military analysis. They become understandable only when you accept that some men simply refuse to lose, that some leaders inspire their followers to achieve what should be impossible. That perfect preparation meeting, perfect timing can create miracles. Admiral Yi gave Korea hope when hope seemed foolish. He gave his sailors courage when courage seemed suicidal. He gave history proof that sometimes David really does beat Goliath, not through divine intervention but through superior tactics, better preparation, and absolute unwillingness to accept defeat. The 13 ships of Myeongnyang saved Korea not just through what they did that day, but through what they represented. The indomitable spirit of a nation refusing to die, and one admiral's genius showing them how to survive.